Hello, everyone. So this is welcome to the Colloquium. I guess I should begin by introducing myself because, yes, none of you know me. My name is Varuni Bhatia, and I teach history at the UG campus. And it's my great pleasure today to be here to listen to Stefan's talk, but also before that to introduce Stefan Teslav and what he is bringing to us today. So Stefan is a historian who works on technology. So he's a historian. He's a historian of science and technology, particularly of infrastructure, as you can see from his talk right here. And his primary interest is in the field of automobile and road construction, and things to do with modernity alongside the coming of the automobiles to South Asia. And today he will be talking to us in his talk about some of his earlier work. More recently, Stefan has been working as a research scholar at the Godrej Archives in Bombay. Prior to that, he has also been associated with NYU in Abu Dhabi. And Stefan has his PhD from University of Göttingen in modern South Asian studies, but also did a year in modern history at JNU in Delhi. So over to you, Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you, Varuni. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to Professor Gowda and for the introduction, Varuni, sorry. I'm really glad all of you could make it, and I'm glad I could make it myself, because the traffic in the city is pretty wild. Yesterday I spent 6 hours in different cabs, in 3 different cabs, coming from the airport to Koramangala, then from Koramangala to Tumkur Road, where I visited the Indian Machine Tool Manufacturers Association, and then another 2 hours coming back from Tumkur Road to Koramangala, again on the ride home. So of course I'm experiencing a luxury problem, talking about 6 hours in an AC cab, but this somehow shows at what level we have reached, India has reached in terms of traffic and transport. That seems to be dominating the lives of a sizable number of people, traffic conditions. And of course it ties as a topic that is of immediate relevance to development in a larger framework. It also ties into other problems of social and political nature. And other social and political problems of development, such as poverty and livelihoods, somehow go along with transport questions or intersect or influence, and vice versa. There's also an impact on the other side. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about. As students of development, education, and public policy, which I think most of you are, I hope this is going to be of interest to you. My interest in my PhD research, which I'm going to present a part of today, was mostly to look at how transport affects and is used by different social groups in different ways. How changes in transport affect different social groups in different ways. And I tracked those changes across the transport sector and across Indian society in various regions of India. So I looked at, for example, at Western UP, primarily at Meerut district, where I tracked the transport entrepreneurs who started investing into motor vehicles and ran bus enterprises on local roads. I looked at passenger transport changes in the area of Bankura and Asansol in West Bengal. And I looked at the relation between motorized transport and bullock cart transport in central and western India, which is the topic of today's talk. And what I'm talking about is primarily about the interwar period. The interwar period, which is between 1919 and 1939, 20 years, a very important decade in terms of historical debates and in terms of larger ramifications that were going on in this period. And yeah, so the period of the Great Depression in the 1930s is the one that I'm primarily focusing on in this presentation. And the main theme is the competition or the relationship between two transport modes that I'm focusing on, which is motorized transport or the motor lorry and the bullock cart. And there's a cultural repertoire now existing in Indian literary and film production that reproduces this relation between motor lorry and bullock cart in different ways. So there's, for example, the film Nayador by B.R. Chopra from the mid to late 1950s, which talks about Tongawalas competing with the local motor lorry, with the bus owned by the village moneylender's son, which talks about the combined effort of the villagers in building a local road for the Tongawala to use this road and to reach the destination before the bus, so that the Tongawalas could survive. And this is underlaid with a now very important and very famous song, Sati Hat Banana. So we give each other a hand to build this road together, kind of a Nehruvian idea of development, if you will, which ties into many other aspects, Shamadan, which one can look at. There's also an Oriya production, it's called Mornunge Shogara. It's a novel and also made into a film, which you see on the right-hand side, the owner of the bullock cart, in a way, enviously looking at the leaving motor bus. And some picture primary document that I found during my research in a collection from a person in Mumbai shows a kind of transport vehicle of those years of the 1930s, and next to it a bullock cart on the left-hand side. So, what am I proposing to do today? The initial part of the title of my talk gives expression of the specific theme I'm going to follow up today, which is the competitive relationship between motor lorry and bullock cart. It would have been more appropriate to add a question mark where the colon is, as I'm primarily interested in whether the relationship of the two transport modes was antagonistic, or if they existed besides or even complemented each other. My talk thus looks at the larger environment and specific emanations of an increase in automobile traffic, and of the continuing importance of bullock cart transport during the period of the 1930s. In particular, it addresses the diverging interests and social relations over earlier and newer transport modes between representatives standing for the motor lorry and those standing for the bullock cart. The representatives of the motor lorry were state institutions and business interests, while the latter included bullock cart owning peasant households, as well as activists and socio-political movements. The paper eventually argues that both the modernizing agents for fronting the benefits of motorized transport, as well as anti-automobile protests of peasants and socio-political activists, overemphasized the transformative effect of modern transport on India's agrarian space during the Depression period. So in my presentation, there's two important initial remarks that I need to make. I'm focusing on Central and Western India, and I'm focusing on the period between, on the 1930s Depression period. Now, why do I do this? The Central and Western India is basically, in those days, Bombay Presidency and the Central Provinces. Those were the two colonial names for those areas, and it encompassed an area ranging about this size. The Central Provinces stretched a bit further, but this is the main, what I term as Central and Western India. It's a made-up region, but I make it up for specific reasons that have to do with a specific trajectory in those regions. And what I found in my research is that Central and Western India, this region that I've outlined, is receiving a vast amount of infrastructure expenditure from the central government, but also from the provincial governments, much more than earlier. So we see a diversion of infrastructure expenditure from the northwest, the Punjab primarily, and the northeast, Assam, and the states of the eastern of eastern India, a relocation from those ends into central and western India. This has to do because there were interest of mineral resource extraction, mining, which was happening in this area, and there was a cotton boom taking place in 19th century central and western India. Cotton was a new product that many more peasants chose to or had to choose to produce. And with this increasing focus on cotton production, the number of roads that were built increased, and the tendency for peasants to own bullock carts also increased. So I'm going later into the further arguments about this, but those are two important aspects for the region, why I'm focusing on central and western India. Now, the depression period of the 1930s is important because it was a period of general economic distress of many peasants, of many people, of many village living folks, and also, of course, of urban people, but I'm primarily in agrarian spaces. So there was economic hardship, and at the same time there was peasant protest. The biggest peasant protest movements in India started and took place in this period, and were a precursor to later protest movements. The state institutions tried to alleviate economic distress of peasants, if only to prevent more Kisans from joining the nationalist movement, because peasant movements and nationalist movements, of course, were intersected at some points. The fact that the state was interested in the peasant protests created, of course, many documents, and this allows me to enter this period as a historian and to read and write about it. And finally, there was a new direction in the situation of trade and transport. Many European merchant houses began to shut down their operations up-country with the beginning of the Depression, and gave way to a greater participation of Indian business houses and to more inland trade. Moreover, the Depression period started a process in which the relationship between old and new transport forms began to change. Rural households began to spend less on long-distance travel, which is mainly the railways, and in comparison, continue to spend as much as before on short-distance travel. So the Mufassil headquarter, the closest town that you were living to, was became more important than going to a further away place, at least for a certain section of the society. So this explains why the region and why this period. This is going to explain the changes in the infrastructure expenditure. There's a difference between the pre-war period, pre-1914, and post-1914, and we see that Bombay presidency is triple the amount of after the war in the interwar period than it is before. So the highest percentage increase in Bombay presidency, really. These aspects of a modernizing infrastructure in a period of depressed economic conditions for large parts of the population combined in a strong way in central and western India. As a result, certain social and political movements in this region were increasingly concerned about the fact that the use of motorized road transport and modernization schemes, infrastructure, clashed with the livelihood of sections of the peasantry. This was primarily predicated on the notion that motor vehicles began to capture a greater share of goods traffic, which decreased the ability of peasants to cart their own and other peasants' produce to the market and thereby generate additional or subsidiary income. Now, this entire aspect of transport changes and the relation between motorized transport and bullock cart transport has not been looked at much. There's Shahid Amin's study of Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph have called bullock cart capitalists. Shahid Amin talks about this in interesting ways, but there's no study which looks at the comparatively at motorized transport and bullock cart transport. Who is able to capture what, and why is one transport form able to sustain itself? So this presentation begins by surveying the economics of animal and motor transport in Central and Western India during the Depression period. It argues that motor transport gained in passenger and goods transport, but could not make inroads into the domain of bullock cart transport to a greater extent. Bullock cart transport persisted not for its resilience to modernization and capitalism, but because of its of several aspects inherent in the economic setup. So very often bullock cart transport was part of an agreement between the merchant and the peasant, that the peasant would transport produce to the market as part of the overall price that was agreed for the produce. In the second part, then, I discuss emerging anxieties and aspirations over changing transport modes. Social and political movements express specific anxieties of certain sections of rural society about adverse effects of motor transport on the possibility of peasants to generate subsidiary income through cart hire. On the other hand, state institutions and commercial actors were dissatisfied with the state of the transport sector and pushed for infrastructure modernization during the Depression. And this is what I call the road motor lobby. You might come across this term during my presentation. So the road motor lobby are those behind improved infrastructure, state institutions, but also businesses like oil companies who want to sell petrol and asphalt, bitumen, merchant houses who want to have a better flow of their freight, and this is what I call the motor road lobby. And there was a sizable number of early Indian motorists. So the Western India Automobile Association is started in this period in the 1930s. I'll start with what is the drier part of the paper. It's about the economics of what was happening at the time. The economics of transport and the relation between two transport forms. There's an interesting book which is worth reading for everyone. I think it's by John DeLoach on forms of transport in India, and he shows why certain types of wheels and certain types of bullock carts continue to exist in different regions of India. So he has, for example, this map here where he shows why in certain parts of India one type of wheel continued to exist, and sometimes those were fully stone wheels. They were not of wood at all. They were completely made out of stone. But gradually beginning in the 18th century, supposedly by a British experimental mission which was placed in the Deccan, those wheels began to transform, and they got spikes, they had more and more wood parts. And what you see in the 1920s and 1930s is that more and more bullock carts are fitted with, bullock cart wheels are fitted with iron tires on top of the bullock cart wheels. So Deloge argues that there was a transport revolution taking place in the 18th century, continuing through the 19th century, but then there was a slack. There was no further improvement, so to speak, on the bullock carts, which is not the case, I would say, and we see later why this is not the case, at least to some extent. So Deloge mainly focused on changes in wheel technology in the mid-19th century and somewhat suggests technological stagnation and socio-economic, after the revolution of the 19th century appeared. Especially the neglect of other technological and socio-economic factors seems unreasonable in his thesis. This applies all the more to important changes in the early 20th century when several new dynamics influenced bullock carts and the larger environment of cart transport. Several technological factors influenced cart use in the 1920s and 1930s. Expanding and improving unmetalled and metalled road networks were important factors in this. Carts were used to the largest extent on earthen and water-bound macadam roads in rural and small town areas. These were not improved to the extent of newly metalled district and provincial roads, but this did not mean that they remained unchanged since the early 19th century. The advantages of cart over motorized transport played out the fullest on rural and minor roads, as motor vehicles could often not cross them. Improvements to waterbound macadam road surfaces, such as sand spraying in Bombay Presidency in the 1930s, provided not only longer life to the road, but also better traction for both motor vehicles and bullock carts. So what we see, I think the picture doesn't come out very clearly, is, for example, on provincial roads, such as this one, which is the Pune-Kirki road, the road between Pune and Kirki, is that you have a middle portion with asphalt, with bitumen sprayed on top, and side portions which have sand surfaces on it so that bullock carts could use them better. And you see really a diversion of traffic. They do not use the same the same surface to travel on. It's segregated in a way, if you wish. And that was an idea of road engineers who thought about putting bullock carts aside, so to allow motorized transport to run more undisturbed. There was a certain disjuncture between attempts by state institutions to provide new roads and their use by bullock carts. Most cart wheels in the late 19th century and early 20th century were shot with iron tires, and these posed no problem to prevalent waterbound macadam road surfaces. New road surfaces of tar macadam, asphalt and cement meant an entirely different scenario. Iron-tired bullock carts destroyed roads so that administrations and engineers made out bullock carts as the major problem for road maintenance. They pushed for updated methods and material in road construction and maintenance and for new traffic rules, therefore. Experiments in Bombay Presidency and elsewhere in the 1930s showed that cement concrete roads were most suitable in areas of both heavy bullock cart and motor. So they soon became the most prevalent type of main road construction. Cement road is the biggest thing which comes in, and there's a certain interest behind this. Today we have the company called ACC, Associated Cement Companies, which is in parts also responsible for the fact that cement roads became so important. The road problem on metal roads due to bullock carts also induced state institutions and commercial actors to introduce new cart equipment such as rubber tires and new cart designs. Provincial departments and research institutions contributed to this in their work on agricultural implements and machinery. The Bombay Agricultural Department developed new ball-bearing cart wheels in the early 1930s, which allowed for reduced draft and greater efficiency. Technical staff tried to cut down, I'm quoting, cut down their price and render them as simple and inexpensive as possible to make them more attractive for potential customers in the peasantry. When commercial firms brought out new tires in this period, state institutions jumped onto the bandwagon and promoted a greater use of rubber tires, as these could alleviate the road problem. Such tires had arguably not only advantages for the road, but more importantly for the cart owner. One bullock per cart could be spared because of the improved wheels. The number of carts could be rationalized to half, and still the same amount of produce would be carried quicker and at a lower maintenance cost. The extra cost would be worked off in about 5 months. That's the argument of, that's of course a commercial argument that some of the tire manufacturers make. So we see Goodyear as one example, who promote the greater use of rubber tires. There's Firestone, there's other companies as examples. But these new tires, of course, brought changes only for some users, for some owners of bullock carts. Not everyone could afford those bullock carts. It was mainly the rich peasantry who were still carting on bullock carts, which could use those rubber tires. Now this brings in the question of the dissemination and the growth of bullock cart use and of bullock cart existence. I've compiled numbers from the agricultural statistics of India, which is a fairly boring and long-winded process, but I've looked at the numbers throughout the 1900s to 1940s and collected these. And they show that in the central provinces, even more than in Bombay Presidency, the number of carts rises exponentially, and much more than another form of transport, which is horse or pony. So the explanation for me was that in the area where the cotton production was highest, which was central provinces, this the number of carts, the great increase in the number of carts was due to cotton production in central provinces. I cannot relate the number of bullock carts with the number changes in population figures. That's fairly impossible. So I can't say if that's an adequate picture, that it's really a growth in bullock cart usage. I've also gone down to the district level to show if there's a certain discrepancy between some districts and others, and especially those cotton-producing districts like Kheda, East Khandesh. Those had a fairly large increase in the number of bullock carts. Sorry. Now, if we compare this with the changes in the number also of motor vehicles, I could get the numbers not from the agricultural statistics, but from annual police reports of Bombay Presidency. I could not access those for the central provinces, so it remains fairly limited. And we see a steady growth of motor vehicles in most districts in the Bombay Presidency during the Depression period in the 1930s, which makes us ask why do these motor vehicles appear in a period of economic distress? And for the region of Western UP, Meerut primarily, I could show that many zamindars and Vaish Baniyas actually purchase motor vehicles to enhance their agricultural production activities. So land and their agricultural production on land is not any longer so profitable during the Depression that they seek other places of investment. There's sugar cane crushing machinery which is being bought so that you can make gur and sell gur, but there's also motor vehicles which are bought and then used as transport vehicles on roads. So that explains why in Bombay Presidency the number of motor vehicles is on the rise. Now there's one very interesting survey of Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, economist, a very important economist who started working in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and continued to work in post-independence India. One of his earliest publications was a survey of motor bus transport in Pune district, Pune city and district, which was made in 1935. He collected a fairly good amount of numbers that I could use and show how the transport sector was structured. There was motor buses were primarily run by bus owner drivers. So the owner was also at the same time driving the bus. He could show the distances that those buses covered, the fare that those buses would charge, the districts and cities where those would primarily run. Then he also supplied some numbers on costs and freight charges. So, for example, the high pricing products like fruits and mostly fruits, some consumer products, they would go onto buses. So we have a picture here of buses waiting at Talegaon railway station in the early 30s. So those are buses which take passengers from the railway station, but at the same time they would have, like you would find in most buses today, they would have a certain section on top of those buses where they could put fruits or other products. So this is what this refers to. In some cases, transporting fruits on those buses was cheaper than transporting via railways or bullock carts. And the place where this was cheaper or comparatively cheaper, because the bus, of course, had an added advantage of bringing it quicker to the destination, that's what Dhananjay Rao Gadgil supplied some numbers for. Yeah, so there was a certain validity for motorized transport to come up to transport products that were otherwise transported by bullock cart transport in this particular period, but it remained, that's something that we can already establish here, it remained rather a phenomenon on the side. It wasn't really taking over bullock cart transport to a great extent. But having said this, I wish to turn now to a second image. Now we've looked at the economic side and explained the relation between the two bullock carts, but there's a second image which is those defenders of the motor vehicle and in a way those who protested against the motor vehicle snatching away freight from the bullock carts. That's the second image which I would like to think about, and those are not images that I think about in opposition, but they go together. They are part of the same story. We've seen how changing transport modes had some impact on specific households and on the economy in rural and small town areas of central and western India in the 1930s. Political and social movements and the public in several places noticed transport changes on a larger scale than in earlier periods and perceived of their detrimental effects for certain sections of agrarian society. The main anxiety was that motor lorries increasingly displaced bullock carts and deprived peasants of an important income source during the economic depression period. And this notion emerged in several places across the region. The existing literature on the links between peasantry and political protest in different regions argues that the nationalist movement voiced only the discontent of a certain section of the peasantry, either a middle peasantry or a rich peasantry. Accordingly, Gujarat nationalists sided with Kunvi Patidas from the rich tobacco growing and dairy farming Charota tracts in southern Kheda district, while Deccan nationalists primarily focused on prosperous commercial farmers in the southern Bombay presidency. The reaching out of the movement to other sections of the peasantry and to less commercialized or even backward regions such as northern Gujarat or Bombay Deccan were neglected so far. And yet there was a greater concern for these regions in the nationalist movement from the early 1920s. The fact that local conditions differed from other areas could be used as further evidence of realities on the ground during the Depression period. Moreover, protest movements also attempted to broaden their social critique. And I'm looking at the broadening of social critique of modern technology and its effect on agrarian spaces across this region. And the first is by Gandhian-inspired anti-automobile protests in Gujarat and in the central provinces. So we see a number of Gandhian number of supporters of Gandhi traveling to districts in this period, into the districts, and finding out more about the economic conditions of peasants. One of the major supporters of Gandhi was Joseph Cornelius Kumarappa, J.C. Kumarappa, who contributed to village surveys, land surveys, and agriculture surveys that were supposed to be critiquing and counter reports to what the colonial state offered you as a report. So he would be much more critical about social changes in those places than the colonial state could ever have been and ever was. And one of the places is in Mata Taluka in Gujarat, where he surveyed local conditions. Possibly in anticipation of the settlement revision of the British district officer, Jesu Kumarappa then found several repercussions of motor vehicles on local society. Trade in the Limbasi group of villages was primarily with Baroda, Kambai and other neighboring towns, to which products were sent either in carts or buses over good motor roads. There was another group of villages, the Navagam group of villages, traded with several larger centers like Ahmedabad and Anand, between which produce was mostly transported on motor lorries. Several villages in this second area complained that the transport of motor lorries ruined their earnings from cart hire, so that they lost 2,000 to 5,000 rupees a year. The use of lorries for goods transport from the Mata group of villages arguably meant not only direct loss of income, but also had more serious repercussions on underemployment of peasants and bullocks. The report says, it is false economy to introduce modern methods of transport, while the bulk of our organization is still in the primitive stage. This causes a great deal of maladjustment, resulting in poverty and distress, which is, end of quote, which is additional distress in a period of already severe conditions. So the British settlement report a year later did not mention any of this. It talked about communications as promoting infrastructure as a civilizing mission. That was the main idea. It talked about how many new roads do we need, how much more investment, but it did not look at all at the social impact of transport changes. At any rate, the coming of modern transport clearly provided one entry point for protests, for political protests, and for the inclusion of this in the economic survey. We do not know who held and employed bullock carts and who was affected by motor transport as a consequence. In the surveyed villages, the more prosperous Patida peasants were in the minority and the comparatively weaker group of Daralas in the majority. The survey noted that peasant families with less than 15 acres did not possess a pair of bullocks each, and extremely smallholders had not even one bullock. This points to the fact that especially richer peasants with a pair of bullocks and a larger holding, agricultural holding, felt a blow to subsidiary income from advancing lorry transport, and that they were able to voice their discontent through the survey. Now we see this this content of anti-automobile protests coming into several surveys at the time, and there was another very important group of political mobilizers, of social activists around the Servants of India Society, who inspired the Deccan Agricultural Association and also the cooperative movement in Bombay, which is quite a different story. It's not the Gandhian people who are around this, but it's more the those who were followers of Gopal Krishna Gokhale in Pune, and people who came after him and who were associated with the Servants of India Society in Pune. Those surveys, there's a set of letters and publications called The Rural Problem. Those point out that what happened in Ahmedabad and in Surat, in Gujarat, was also taking place in the Pune region, in the Bombay Deccan. So the one statement from this publication, The Rural Problem, is that the traffic has practically been captured by the motor, and the poor man has no traffic left for him. The poor man being the bullock cart owner. So those are fairly different views that we see here. The British survey reports do not mention any critical voice at all, whereas the social movements and those who voice the political protest, of course, have a very strong notion of what the motor vehicle does to rural India, did to rural India. In addition, the Deccan Agricultural Association argued that the impact of motorized transport on the peasant household went much beyond the question of subsidiary income. Peasant families with direct access to main roads left bullock carts behind and instead used bus services to sell vegetables in the nearby market. For this, they incurred comparatively heavy expenses of up to 10 rupees per year for freight and conveyance. According to the association, this added unnecessary expenditure for their worsening situation with high assessment rates and lower agricultural income that could be used better elsewhere. Motor transport displaced one of the most important secondary occupations in villages and made bullocks unproductive for much of the year, so that the peasant now, I quote the Deccan Agricultural Association, spends for the bus and feeds the bullock. For the time being, however, the bullock cart was the fundamental factor in agriculture, which had to be kept busy all the year round, which means carting, oil crushing, and other aspects for which bullocks were used. There's the Maharashtra Provincial Congress Committee, which argued that the motorized transport had an effect on the decline of village industries. So those artisans who were engaged in tire making, in wheel making, wooden wheel making, had less of an income because of the greater use of motorized transport. Social and political movements in Central and Western India therefore incorporated anti-automobile protests into their social critique. The main idea was that motorized transport gradually encroached upon peasants, villages, and their social fabric. This new political and cultural imagery also provided the background for the emergence of similar images in later years. It resurfaced, for example, in Legislative Assembly discussions in 1938 in the run-up to a new Motor Vehicles Act. In the discussion of this Motor Vehicles Act, N.G. Rangar, a very important peasant leader from South India, argued that Mahatma Gandhi's slogan, "Down with motor cars," several years ago eventually proved to be correct, as the coming of buses and lorries hit bullock car transport and therefore peasants hard. Instead of promoting motor transport, according to Ranga, the state better provided some employment for the lakhs and lakhs of bullock cart drivers that were thrown out of employment. This anti-automobile discourse eventually also informed content and rationale of various forms of literary and cultural productions in journals and short stories from the 1930s onwards that we've seen in the beginning of the paper. So what was the new discourse about motor vehicles and bullock carts about? And this is the final section which I talk about aspirations of state and commercial actors, basically the road motor lobby. Anxieties, as expressed by social and political movements, were also a response to several changes around the use of motorized transport in the political economy of Central and Western India during the 1930s. This included new forms of travel and migration, changing modes of marketing and consumption, and new forms of capital formation that were favorable for some and detrimental to other sections of society. More importantly, the anxieties grew even more strongly with a new and much stronger modernization discourse that picked up midway through the Depression and exerted a greater influence later on. The main agents of this new discourse were state institutions and commercial actors who regarded the contemporary state of road transport as insufficient and then pushed for further improvement of the road network, more modern transport equipment, and greater attention to the development of motorized transport. This new modernization discourse found expression in different fora. The discourse was in a way specific to Central and Western India, where the presence of motorized transport and road interests transport and road interests was much stronger, and their lobby work influenced government decisions more than elsewhere. There were several examples of such a close liaison between the motor lobby and the state.
In the 1930s, in the 1933, the government of Bombay decided to reintroduce tolls on provincial and local roads in the presidency 10 years after they had been abolished. Bombay's transport lobby and upcountry motorists cried out fiercely against this tax, and this manifested itself in newspaper reports and public discussions. The transport lobby continuously protested against the tax later on, and eventually proposed the introduction of a compounded motor vehicle tax, which would make it easier for the state to collect taxes and cheaper for the motorists, of course. This removed registration fees and road tolls and improved motoring upcountry. The Bombay government accepted these proposals and introduced a new tax in 1936, primarily on account of continued representation by the IRTDA, which is the Indian Roads and Transport Development Association, and the WIAA, which is the Western India Automobile Association. The provincial government continued to listen to the road lobby even later on, much more than to the peasant lobby. The IRTDA and Bombay Road Board urged the government to finance road development by bonds in the 1930s. New financial means then came in 1935, and these provided the basis for greater road building activities under the Congress ministries in the second part of the 1930s. This created the impression that motorists easily found advocates. Whereas bullock carts hardly ever received strong backing in political institutions. In meetings of the Bombay Road Board, few Mufassil representatives like Khan Bahadur Bumanji from Satara district pointed out the detrimental effects of reintroduced road tolls on bullock cart transport, especially around small towns and markets. The government of Bombay considered such statements, but this never influenced lawmaking. Bullock carts continued to pay tolls after 1936, also because local boards wanted to charge owners for damage to roads. State and motor road interests recognized bullock carts as an important feature in the agrarian world. They mostly discussed them, however, as destructive to roads and obstructive to fast vehicular traffic, and as financial contributors to an expanding road network or as objects of improvement. These developments in the political and commercial sphere represented somewhat of a success of the road motor lobby in promoting mechanical transport vis-à-vis state institutions. This agenda setting and its reception in official circles ultimately also created the impression of adverse effects on bullock carts, and in some cases it also impacted bullock cart transport in detrimental ways. This was also a question of representation. While large corporate capital and Bombay's political machinery strongly backed the motorists and the metal road, the bullock cart could hardly hope to be patronized except by social political movements, local political leaders, Mufassil traders, and through its own relevance in the agrarian economy. The following statement by the economist Dhananjay Rao Gerkil on the future of the bullock cart sounded both bleak and promising at the same time. And I'm quoting here, "There are no ways in which the bullock cart owners can organize to meet the competition of the buses. Neither can any special legislative steps be recommended to protect their interests. The general environment, however, favors the bullock cart, and its struggle with the bus is bound to be prolonged." So we see here in this paper a confluence of different interests backing motorized transport and backing bullock carts, and these tie into notions of development, of economic development, as well as of social distress, social and economic distress of certain populations. And I hope this is useful for you in thinking about the history of development, maybe the history of economic development. And yeah, I'm open for questions if any are there. Thank you so much.
Dant? You. I thought you had something on your mind. That's it seemed like that.
Hey, hi. It's a very interesting facet, and So, one thing that came to my mind after listening to your talk was that probably India is the only, am I not audible? Yeah, am I?
Oh, yes.
So I think India is probably the only country in the world which, even at this moment, has bullock carts, which are widely used in the country still.
Mm-hmm.
And also we are going to have a bullet train soon. So we have across the platform, we have all the transport.
Mm-hmm.
But so speaking about bullet train, one thing that really came to my mind was that how some of this discourse of modernization, which was taking place at that period of time, are also taking place at the current discussion on how bullet train, the social costs of the train, and who is it for, who are the people who are going to actually travel down that, and is it really for the poor people, or is it for the business community, and so on. So being a historian, so there are two types of historians. One who believes that history repeats, and others who say that history never repeats. So in that context, do you think that history is going to repeat, in this, or is it that we only have some things to learn from that, but it's going to be a different kind of a discourse this time?
Well,
We normally take a couple of questions.
okay, sure, yeah.
Are there any? Stefan, I had a question. I remember the Mysore state wanted to have its own automobile plant, but with the association of the American car manufacturers, and the British weren't happy about that, and they didn't let it take off. So I was wondering if you can reconstruct the arena of car manufacturers, countries of origin, their pressure lobbies, etc. And secondly, even when we have J.C. Kumarappa making that argument about the automobile being not a welcome thing in this country, what kinds of discourses are they plugged into, internationally speaking? Are there discussions of the car, critical discussions of why the car is not a welcome object in the West? Have they traveled here? Is there any sense of that sort of association?
Can you repeat the second part?
Is there a wider climate of dissent against the car as a modern vehicle?
Yeah.
That Kumarappa and Gandhi, whoever else may have been, because I remember Lohi had a even more radical proposition. He said India should never have a car. Cars should never be allowed to run in this country. And that was a socialist understanding of why a car was not needed. So are there other kinds of discussions about why the car is not a good thing? One last question.
I'm not able to correctly frame my question, because I'm really trying to link how the current scenario is very similar to what our history suggests. When we talk about road expansions, like you also mentioned how we are navigating towards concrete roads and stuff, it's still, and the fact that we also have a lot of cars running on the road right now, but we also continue to negate the presence of peasantry, whose life is actually dependent on the kind of the roadways that were existent. And now that we're shifting towards a more concrete, less environment friendly or less sustainable model of expansions, again, it seems like history is repeating itself again. And also, the fact that when you're talking about bullet trains or metros and or even electric trains linking between a suburban area and an urban area, there is a lot of politics between the transport corporations, say, be it a lobby that's for pro bus transports, who are not very interested in a train being implemented between a suburban and an urban area. So again, your social interests come into play. So how do you think all this is, it's almost like history is repeating itself, and it's continuing to do that, and it's, so I'm not really able to come to a consensus. I'm just able to relate that history is just repeating itself till date.
Yeah, I'll take your two questions together and or remarks and think about this with you. There's, I mean, look at my own statement that I made. Spending 6 hours in a cab is too much. That's not something that I want. You could see this as a statement of someone who wants this to be quicker, you know, to reach the destination quicker. So I could be said to be part of the motor road lobby who wants to improve the free flow of traffic and make it easier. So that's a current discussion, and many of us who are able to use such modern transport forms such as Uber, we would be on that side, and our activities, our actions, the way we behave, our life, the way we lead our life is conducive to what's going to happen in the political sphere. At the same time, you have the idea of a democratic transport mode. That's a discussion that comes up in a lot in the European context, because of course in Europe you find the social welfare state, and the welfare state was also interested in providing transport to its populations. So you had state-owned railways, which is the case also here in India, state-owned railways, state-owned public transport, for which users did not have to pay much. And there seems to be a movement away from democratizing transport, from making transport available to as large a number of people as possible. But even to that, there's a certain politics. So you have, for example, the metro in Delhi coming up, and soon there will be a metro here. With the building of the metro, you have this, which comes across and fulfills some of the demands of a democratic form of transportation. But it also displaces people. It leads to the fact that property prices rise in certain areas and people cannot continue to live in those areas. It has impacts which one might not figure out in the beginning of building this new transport form, but effects that are certainly important for the social fabric of a city, for example. Yeah, so there's many different sides to this discussion, and the thing that researchers can do, if you were to focus on something like this, is to look at case studies and looking at how this figures out in specific ways, just in the way I did or tried to do in this part of my dissertation. It's really a differentiated impact of a specific transport form and of its impact on social lives that you can track down. Yeah, I wouldn't say history repeats itself. It's you can say history adds a new layer to it. Features that did not come about, they come up now. So there's we shouldn't think about history as a repetition, but as a layering process where one supplements the other and sort of adds to something that is already in existence. And Chandan's, Professor Gowda's question on Mysore state, of course there was Moksha Visvesvaraya, who was one of the earliest promoters of India having its own automobile industry. There's extensive documentation of correspondence between Moksha Visvesvaraya and Walchand Hirachand. Moksha Visvesvaraya pushed Walchand Hirachand to provide capital and to establish a motor factory, first in Mysore, but then the discussions went Walchand Hirachand to think about Bombay as a place for an automobile factory. The government of India and the government of Bombay were unwilling to take those plans on board and unwilling to provide land or financial assistance to those enterprises, which is why in those days, in the mid-1930s, early 1930s to mid-1930s, the factories did not come up. They only came up in the context of the Second World War, when some industrialists went abroad and concluded agreements with foreign manufacturers. Walter Niedertran, in this case, had an agreement with Chrysler and later on with Fiat to produce Premier Padmini from the late 1940s onwards. The international car manufacturers in the 1950s had a particular approach to India. They had a sizable number of assembly plants here in, I think, across India, in all regions of India, in Punjab, in Bombay, in Chennai, in Kolkata. But they did not establish manufacturing. They did not make those parts in India. They always said it's easier for us and better for us, for our business, to import the spare parts and to assemble them in India and then sell, rather than manufacturing themselves. And when the government of India, when Nehru's policies under the first 5-year plans came in, Nehru and his policy advisors said, we can't allow, especially General Motors and Ford, to continue doing this. We want these American companies to produce the car in India fully and not just import, so to have positive, to have an impact on a positive impact on ancillary industrial development. They wanted to increase the depth of manufacturing in India to have an economic benefit from automobile manufacture, which is one of the items that you can produce which has the largest impact on an economy, in a way, in a traditional way of understanding an economy. But that's how they thought. And so GM and Ford basically left India in the 1950s because they did not agree to the Nehruvian plan to establish full-phase manufacturing in India. There were other manufacturers then which came in. One is Daimler-Benz. They had an agreement with Telco in Jamshedpur to make the Tata truck. And Daimler-Benz was a minority shareholder in this joint venture that came up. And the agreement lasted for 15 years. Then Daimler-Benz went out of the country. And so this was a very different notion of governance that came into this joint business collaboration, where India was not willing to, in a way, to conform to international manufacturers' ideas, but they were setting their own targets, and they asked the companies to comply with those targets and didn't want to compromise. Yeah, so that's basically the two angles between which the history of automobile manufacture has been going between. And it's still the same is still happening now. There are certain manufacturers who have come here, who produce here, who make engines, the most technologically advanced product here in India. I suppose Maruti Suzuki is one example. They would produce their engines here in India. But other international manufacturers continue to just import parts and not manufacture in the country. And I've always asked myself, why can China set up companies in China with 50% ownership of the state? And this seems to have had a very good positive impact on economic development in China. Why is India not in the same position to be able to command international capital to, if they want to set up production in India, to that the Indian state or the Indian population in a way has a certain say in how manufacturing functions. So it's, I mean, in the case of the automobile industry, you can see quite different ideas of economic development and of steering the economy in forward between China and India.
Hello. So, what struck me in a big way while hearing your talk was the relationship between a traditional mode of transportation, the bullock cart, and modern technology and infrastructure-driven mode of transportation, which is the motor car. So you draw up this dialectic really well, where the coming of the motor car does not simply mean the phasing out of the bullock cart, but that the bullock cart continues in different ways, continues to be a problem. There are, there are negotiations that are going on between bullock cart users and motor car users and their lobbies. I'm wondering if we triangulated that relationship by bringing in the railways into the picture more prominently to reflect upon what are the kind of changes in mobility of goods and people that are being made possible. Now, when we think about images of nationalist leaders, we think about the train. They are almost never on bullock cart or motor cars. It doesn't mean they didn't use these two modes of transportation, but the iconic pictures are at railway stations and around trains. The iconic kind of the key stories are around railway trains, whether it's Gandhi being thrown out in South Africa or, those kinds of, or the foot, obviously. What is going on with the railways, and how are the railways, if you were to introduce the railways into this story, what would your story be like?
Yep, very interesting. Yep, great question. That ties in with Chandan's remark on Gandhi rejecting the automobile entirely, as a part of the nationalist movement, and another part of the nationalist movement was espousing another type of transport, which is the railways, in such a prominent way. Also a device that was developed, and often railways were often produced at the time in the 1920s and 30s. They were produced in Britain, so they were as much a foreign device as the motor vehicle was, if foreign technological device, if you wish. So the question is, why do they have so different trajectories then? That's a great question. The railways, so the story that I try to picture here between the motor lorry and the bullock cart can equally be looked at between the motor lorry and the railways. Because the railways, all the different railway companies in India started to complain increasingly that the motor vehicles would snatch away traffic from them. And especially on the short routes between district headquarters, not between, Bombay and Delhi, but between Meerut and Delhi. And on those roads where there was a lot of traffic of local customers, the motor buses were increasingly able to snatch away passenger traffic from the railways, and especially in the third class, amongst third class passengers, which is the lowest paying for the railways. And they still made a big fuss about this. They made a big uproar that they were losing passengers, and saw this as a financial, a question of financial existence. And this has to do with the fact that the railways increasingly became state-owned in India. The state bought out the railway companies, in a way bailing them out because they couldn't run on profit anymore, so they bought them out. This started in the late 19th century, but then was finished in the late 1920s. So, and then the railways were fully state-owned, but up till then, they were largely owned by British companies, by British capital, depending on the region and specific railway lines. But yeah, so they become a part of the budget of the government of India. And once the railways become part of the budget, of course, you want to make sure that they do not lose out. You're willing to invest more than you get out from it, but you don't want to compromise the existence of the enterprise, despite it being state-owned. So a lot of discussion came up about how to improve railway finances. And motorized traffic was seen as one of the ways that was sort of taking away finances from the railways. And then this was basically the emergence of motor vehicle laws. So you had the permit system for taxis and buses came up in the 1930s because the railways, the local district traffic authorities, which were heavily influenced by the railways, wanted to make sure that the buses would not take over. So you had the permit system, which was supposed to limit buses, the use of buses. You had different other laws which were implemented in the districts, and that were basically geared towards mitigating the effects of increased motorized transport.
Can I ask you one more follow-up question? The bus transportation, are these companies largely local Indian capitalists? So they're local entrepreneurs who are buying a fleet of buses, 2, 4, 10, whatever, and running them short distances between different towns and key market centers.
The local capitalists, so most of the owners are local capitalists. I should say it varies between regions. So in the Bombay-Deccan, it was owner-drivers who often owned 1 or 2 buses and were not the property class, let's put it this way, but they were also very poor. But for Western UP, I could find out that in Mira district, there were Vaishmanias, Muslim Zamidas, Punjabi Khatri merchant, also there were 3 or 4 different social groups which owned the motorized transport. And in Mira, I would show something else which is important, which was also to do with the railways and the state finances. The government of India reform in the 1920s meant that the central government wanted to get rid of certain expenditure items. Education is one. So education was given into the hands of the provinces. The other one is roads. Local roads and district roads were not continued to be financed by the central government, but by the states. And this meant that the provinces also had an interest to get rid of financing the roads that were of less importance. So local roads were even more neglected after 1920 because they were less financed. So what the local district authorities did, the district magistrate, he gave local roads, in many cases, he gave them out to transport entrepreneurs and allowed them to monopolize the road. In a way, the first kind of public-private partnership that you can think of in India. So the capitalists said, give me the road, I will maintain it, I will maintain it, I will make sure that it's in good, proper shape, and you allow me to use my motor bus on this road. Forgiving me for the fact that I maintain the road, that I put an effort in maintaining it. So that was the agreement. It didn't really work out. I mean, of course, the Zamindars and the Vaishbanias had no interest in keeping up the roads in a good way. So you had all kinds of different discussions between the government and the local capitalists that they should put in more effort. But that's one further aspect that adds to it. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Afsal. I am from MPG, first year. Very nice to hear this story. I think it's very interesting and eye-opening. I just want to ask you one question on the colonialization period. The first motor vehicle reached India would be the colonial rulers imported individual cars, I guess, or public transport.
So can you repeat again? Sorry.
The question is, the initial motor vehicles reached India will be used by the rulers of colonial rulers. That is imported from the UK. So what was the when the public transport, motorized public transport got introduced in India, what is the difference in the timeline?
Okay, I think there's a report about the first motor vehicle in Bombay in 1906 or 1909. So of course this was a phenomenon which started in the cities, in the big cities, where the imports trickled in first and where there was a sizable class of people that could afford those vehicles. And at the time, in the early 20th century, it was a diverse number of manufacturers from abroad, European, but also American. But as time went on, there was a bifurcation in a way of the markets. So in the urban centers, you had much better roads, so you could use heavier transport vehicles. And this market was primarily British. So you had in trucks, you had Leyland, you had all different kinds of producers, British producers, and you had the British manufacturers. Those were mainly used in the cities, in the big cities. But up country, what we are talking about here, the roads were very bad, so you needed light vehicles, and those were mostly American. So the Ford and GM made the Model T and the subsequent models, which were much lighter than what the British actually made. So this would be one example of a lighter type of motor vehicle than you would find in the cities, for example. And this goes on. I mean, this discussion goes on until the 40s, 50s, where this is still continuing.
So local manufacturing happened when?
Local manufacturing then started in the late 40s. Hindustan Motors of Birlas first started producing in Gujarat in 48, but then shifted to Uttarpara in Kolkata in the early 50s, 52. And Walchand Hirachand here, Premji Automobiles in Bombay started in 49, 50. There was a tussle between Birla and Walchand Hirachand about who would start the first automobile company. And Walchand Hirachand calls it Premji Automobiles because he wanted to be the first, but he wasn't actually the first. So yeah, the 40s, late 40s.
Thank you.
We are running out of time, but this is one question. Stefan, can you comment on the motor laws that evolved here? How, just like our IPC, a lot of it was just taken straight from the UK, from England. But in our motor laws, was it something similar? Did you see a pre-made set of things that came in, or did they evolve? And who were involved in this work?
They were very much based on the British traffic rules and regulations, all kinds of legislation around the motor vehicle insurance, the idea that you had accidents and you needed to control accidents. All those new laws that came up were all based on the British example. Yeah, they were in many ways discussed in the legislatures, in the assemblies in Delhi, but also in the provincial legislatures, and that's one of the resources that I used for the paper and for my dissertation. Where you see a clash of interests, where you see Naranga, for example, from Tamil Nadu, saying that the motor vehicle has an adverse impact. But I've not been able to find out if there was any local or Indian participation in making the law, in establishing the law. I think it was fairly colonial and set on the president of Britain. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. This was really amazing. And the first talk that I heard Stefan give in a conference 3 or 4 years ago also had to do with a similar topic, but there I think you were talking about roads.
About Meerut.
And Meerut, yes, and that was around Meerut. And just to let you all know a glimpse into why I find Stefan's work really riveting is because it also relates to my own family history. And this is the second talk that I've been to by Stefan, and I couldn't help. So my great-grandfather was amongst the earliest contractors to build roads in Karachi in 1920s, and had a transportation company, and was likely one of the people who would have been a part of running buses and trucks in and around Karachi. I just messaged my father, and I found out that my grandfather's brother was a member of the Automobile Association.
Wow. Wow.
So that you just talked about.
Very good.
So each time I come to his talk, I feel like I learned something about myself, which is incredibly, which is incredible given that it's about something as away from our personal lives as policy decisions and roads and buses. So thank you very much, Stefan.
Great. Super. Great. Thank you. That's amazing. Which automobile association is it? Western India?